Welcome. Brian Balke here one last time as we complete our journey into reconciliation of physics and spirituality. Before beginning this lecture, I feel compelled to share how I started down this path. I was passing through a dark season of the soul in 2002. At work one day, Time magazine arrived in the mail, sporting a cover that projected the end of the universe. All matter would turn into iron or be swallowed up by neutron stars and black holes. Life would vanish from the cosmos. Human existence, therefore, lacks meaning or value. Well, that wasn't what I needed to hear. Peering over the edge of that conceptual abyss, I opened my heart and mind to possibilities for escape. The supermassive black holes at the center of galaxies caught my attention. Galaxies are bound in clusters and occasionally pass through each other. After all the stars had been gobbled up, still there was the possibility, no matter how slight, that two AGNs would collide, spewing out matter and energy to grant life a future purchase in the cosmos. I relaxed momentarily before realizing that maybe that was how it all started. For my master's literature survey, I chose to review axion theory. We haven't spoken of axions because they have fallen out of fashion. The axion was one of many hypothetical particles spawned by the gauge invariance principle introduced in our first lecture. What is relevant to our discussion is this. Any self-organizing field with 3 degrees of freedom will produce defects in the fabric of space. Now that's a technical statement, but what occurred to me was that the fabric of space, which has 3 directions, has itself 3 degrees of freedom. So imagine a reality in which the fabric of space builds itself from seeds throughout the cosmos. Where these seeds come together, tension will form as they attempt to align, providing the energy for quasars in AGN formation. Upon this insight followed the geometric parable that I will share with you today. This realization was followed by trepidation. Was this knowledge safe for humanity? The beautiful sunshine of a spring day beckoned. I left to walk up the boulevard for lunch. A vision formed. Behind me, a mountain-sized asteroid streaked through the atmosphere, trailing turbulent vapor trails. My perception oscillated between the spring day and this vision, which moved forward until the meteorite smashed into the hills facing me. I had the vague sense of ejecta passing through me as the suburb around me was annihilated. No, no. I choose that spring day. The vision passed. Such is the practice of intention. We began our journey by categorizing the explanations that we use to organize our physical and spiritual experience. While initially in human history, those explanations were motivated to facilitate creative collaboration, in the modern era, the ideas have a life of their own. In considering the progression in physics, we identified 2 principles, the emptiness and smoothness of space, that drive scientists to the conclusion that spiritual experience is illusory. In our second lecture, we evaluated the corollaries to these principles in both relativity and quantum theory, eventually concluding that we have evidence to justify rejecting them. I also surveyed the magnitude of the socioeconomic forces that make academia unlikely to engage with these insights. In today's lecture, I am going to offer a geometric parable. I will not seek to justify the parable through calculation, for the picture has evolved since it first came to me in 2002. Taking the immune system as a metaphor, nudge, nudge, hint, hint, the elements of the model cannot be derived from abstract principles, but only recognized as fulfilling an intended purpose. For this reason, I seek only to dispel the negativity projected onto those among you that offer your spiritual gifts as an act of love. I believe that the parable should be sufficient to you, as indeed it was for me. To cement that liberation, I will elaborate in the second part of this lecture the correspondence between the parable and the teachings of our great spiritual exemplars. As it has evolved, I am ever more in awe of the power and subtlety of the cosmic mind. Considering the disasters rolling down upon us, I can only pray that humanity, at long last, has the discipline to organize those gifts. The conceit of modern particle physics is that nothing is different from anything else. This means that our experience must be absorbed into a unifying mathematical framework that grows larger with every discovery. In the mythos of modern physics, we accept the existence of hidden directions of motion and universes that we will never detect, much less experience. Today we will go in the opposite direction. We will introduce a parable that builds from one spatial dimension into higher dimensions. It begins with a model of the fabric of space, enhances it with an explicit model of spirit, and finds the forces known to physics in linking the two together. Once again, please overlook the deficiencies of the parable. Those filled with the ambition to absorb the cosmic mind may busy themselves with building a predictive model. For myself, I have trust in love, and it turns my attention elsewhere. To build the fabric of space, start with quanta. We can think of these as little bar magnets, which we know prefer to line up end to end. When other elements are added to this universe, they can yet only move along the line. Now imagine that the chain hits an impenetrable boundary and buckles. Mechanically, the triangle is the only stable two-dimensional shape. Because the quanta are all the same length, they form equilateral triangles, which pack uniformly to fill a plane. Now imagine that the plane extends until it encounters an impenetrable perimeter. To continue to grow, it must buckle. Is it possible to fill a volume with a lattice made of triangles? No, but perhaps we can build a regular lattice if we align the triangles with the sides at the corner of a cube, which we know that we can pack to fill space. In the upper right corner, we present this configuration from two angles. In the lower right, we see how these cells come together to fill a volume. Note that this configuration is not rigid. It has gaps around the cells that allow other elements to move through the volume. What happens if this lattice is compressed by an impenetrable bag? Could it buckle again to form lattices of higher dimension? I find this hard to visualize, but then my mind is adapted to visualize only in 3 dimensions. Now to this lattice, imagine adding stretchy loops. For simplicity, I indicate the effects on a 2-dimensional lattice. If the loop prefers to be circular, it is distorted when forced around the triangles of the lattice. The lattice is also distorted, pushing against the boundaries that contain it. Through this mechanism, energy is stored in the lattice. Extending this now to 3 dimensions, loops can slip between and around cells, forming complex configurations that might be interpreted as information. As hinted at in our first presentation, we call these configurations spirit. Thinking back to our spiritual explanations, we might propose 3 categories. Disembodied souls, such as angels, demons, or ghosts, might predate the creation of the lattice. Incarnations are souls bound to the lattice as living creatures. Ideas encode patterns of behavior that living creatures pass from generation to generation. Incarnated souls, such as ourselves, may extend our loops into the lattice and around other objects. It is through these projections that we practice spirituality, the negotiation of the boundaries between I and we. Now on to matter. What would happen if the loops could be trapped in the cells of the lattice? If we allow that the loops don't like to be close, as each cell has 3 triangles, there are 4 possibilities. Above our table of the known fermions, we show configurations where the cell has trapped 0, 3, 1, and 2 loops. In the terminology of electric force, each loop adds 1/3 of a charge to the cell. Now imagine that we tug on a loop. This will distort the lattice as the cell passes, which is the effect caused by mass in Einstein's theory of gravity. It seems natural for the neutrino, which has no loops, to cause minimal distortion. The electron with 3 loops is balanced in every direction, and so should not tumble as it moves. Compare this to the up and down quarks, which are unbalanced. This imbalance would tend to lead to tumbling that would manifest as greater disruption of the lattice. Thus, mass should increase from left to right. This is what is actually observed phenomenologically. For the technically sophisticated, I will elaborate the correspondence now with the 4 known forces. If we assume that the lattice, in minimizing disruption, localizes disruptions, the unbalanced quarks will tend to be pushed together most forcefully to create balanced aggregates. This corresponds to the strength of the color force. Next, the lattice will try to create configurations of loops that curl around each other to form bubbles. This pressure corresponds with electromagnetism. Outside of these bubbles, the lattice would still bloat gently, causing neutral matter to coalesce under the force that we call gravity. This explains 3 of the 4 forces. The final force, the weak force, corresponds to interactions that transfer loops between cells. From observations at our accelerators, this requires large inputs of energy. Now as to fermion generations, the different rows in our table of fermions. The explanation is indicated in the cell configurations to the right of the table. In the first case, 2 of the triangles link together, creating an expanded cell that with motion will affect more of the lattice. In the third most disruptive configuration, the cell is fully expanded. In our geometric parable, then, we should have 3 and only 3 generations of fermions. Note that in this model, mass is determined according to the complex dynamical interactions between particles and the lattice. The specific masses we observe should be calculable from factors including the size of the quanta, the stiffness of the lattice, and the elastic properties of the loops. Taking our parable as an assumption, what can we expect for the future of physics? First, physics studies only the aspects of reality that lack the free loops of personality. Worse, in the modern era, experimental methods are intensely destructive. At energies billions of times lower than achieved at CERN, we know, for example, that electroconvulsive therapy leaves patients testifying as to having lost myself. Given that souls do not have to hang around to be studied, why then would they choose to submit to observation? As a corollary then, physics can neither prove nor disprove spirituality. Conversely, physicists should be encouraged to take spiritual experience as a signpost for future theoretical development. To be blunt, until the theorists develop a little faith, they're going to wander in the wilderness. From the title of this lecture series, the militant atheist might assume that I would give religion a pass. The incoherence that rules fundamental physics should be taken, however, as a demonstration of a general principle. Mystery is the crockpot of hypocrisy. The atheist can rejoice that if eternal mysteries are the soil of religion, intellectual laziness is its weed. If there is anything more painful to me than watching a Nova special on the multiverse, that would be a pastor preaching the gospel of self-justification. Please think back, though, to our first lecture. Explanations should serve human fulfillment. The lesson of the preceding section should not be zut, Brian et Briand, but rather, isn't it amazing that physics could be redeemed so easily from the choice to ignore moral implications? In this last lecture, then, in this last section, then, I am going to return to the Gnostic perspective to try to demonstrate that the physicist of rationality, properly supported, clarifies the teachings of our religious avatars. I took a neutral stance when framing the topic of spirituality in our first lecture. With skepticism at bay, let's revisit the Gnostic perspective. In response to the question, is meaning revealed to our sense? The Gnostic responds, no. This reality was created with a purpose and imbued with intention. What might those intentions be? Well, most religions hold that there are two sides to the question. Looking at the history of the universe, we might state the first as, the cosmic mind is infinitely enamored of the potentiality of living things. The bullet points sketch the evidence. The universe tends towards ever more rapid forms of evolution, culminating with tool makers who can get at a worm in a hole by picking up a tweezers. In one meme, I put it this way: don't let size intimidate you. In their density, intensity, and variety, the choices made within you are greater than all the choices made in all the stars in the galaxy. You are meaningful. On the flip side, the cosmic mind is inexorably destructive of selfish personalities. Let's walk through this in more detail. Personality is not encoded in our brains, but our souls. For all the reasons on the left, incarnation is attractive because it provides an opportunity to evolve our souls, particularly through our relationships. In managing our relationships, we are given the refuge of our body, which is dense and therefore resistant to penetration. In the exercise of this free will, however, we may choose to hide from our obligations and lay traps for others. Rather than honoring them as teachers, we seek to steal from their grace. The fascinations of the body have a consequence, however. The more we invest ourselves in physical things, the tighter our loops are bound to them. When the body collapses, some of our personality remains trapped. Thus, selfish personalities over the course of their lives deteriorate. If you weren't shocked in the last side with the idea that death may be a tool of liberation, let me elaborate further. Fear of death rationalizes atrocities, whether personal or collective. Told that their children are at risk, parents will design weapons, fund militaries, and send their sons off to war. This is the rationalization of sacrifice carried forward as part of our precursor spirituality. Sadly, it is also the logic of subjugation. When livelihoods depend upon exploitation of those without weapons, violence is the cheapest way to protect our children from loss of privilege. Where, then, is the comfort for the oppressed? First, privilege is necessarily a divorce from reality. The oppressed, closer to the ground, understand how things work. They are necessary to the survival of the privileged. The sophisticated oppressor, therefore, delegates violence to proxies who are conditioned to believe that the oppressed are a threat. Lacking hope, both proxies and oppressed lose motivation. In effect, their souls seek to disengage from their bodies. But because loops can't be tied together, the privileged cannot prevent this escape, only accelerate it. Still, the oppressed produce and nurture children. there is always another generation to exploit. And yet, in consuming every wave of children, the predator projects personality into them. Each burial carries a little more of the predator's will into the grave. Many human predators, then, choose to project illusions and ambush the naive. Pursued by a predator, then, how do we know that we are in danger? Because it takes energy to pull loops through matter. When attuned to the experience, we can literally feel the burning heat passing through our bodies. A lover, conversely, celebrates our personality. We feel as though filled with the warmth of light. The predator's gilded manse is an anchor for predatory intentions. Don't be seduced by the glitter. Rather, have pity on the privileged. They will leave most of their personality behind. We will return intact. Upon this perspective, the lover of humanity builds a practice of spiritual jujitsu, which is a topic for another day. If tyranny is self-annihilation, then what is the most powerful personality in the realm of spirit? I offer this evolutionary argument in support of unconditional love. Love begins by bearing witness to its object, shielding it from corruption. That shield becomes a trap, however, if love does not also offer gifts, which in the realm of personality can be only relationships. As perhaps a defining characteristic, love is a pattern of behavior, mediates marvelous relationships, in which the whole is far greater than the sum of the parts. Unconditional love seeks nothing in return, but is validated and supported by the gratitude of the personalities that it protects as they explore creative collaboration. If selflessness is essential to the efficacy of love, yet it is selves that love unites, does this extend to amplification of selfishness? Rather the opposite, for through the witness of others, love safeguards the humble. Even more, to maintain control, selfish personalities must hide from love, lest their captives be witnessed by love and liberated. Packed together in desperation, selfish personalities tear each other apart, granting their captives opportunities to escape in the chaos. As creative collaboration multiplies the capacities held in the witness of love, enthusiasm builds for granting entry to others. This invitation vibrates on the borders of love's continually expanding realm. If we measure the instantaneous velocity of a falling object, what can we conclude regarding the law of gravity? Well, nothing. Validation of our explanations requires comparison between initial and final states. Descartes refined exploratory monotheism to a single proposition. God must exist because the concept of perfection cannot be formed in an imperfect mind. The corollary is that reality in its conception must be perfect, for a perfect mind would not create an imperfect reality. We are therefore the sole authors of the pain that we experience and offering our love to the world. A rather more humane perspective is that while unconditional love is perfect in its intentions, the conditions upon formation of this reality were far from ideal. Thomas Merton observed that selfishness is the root of all sin. I agree. In fact, the proposition that this reality was created to contain selfishness is consistent with our characterization of the cosmic mind. This is not a prison, however, but a hospital. For the sophisticated patient, matter is both a bandage and an antigen. It is just this sophistication that our spiritual avatars seek to cultivate. In a context of social rigidity, Buddha taught that pain is a signal that we should change. Suffering arises when we refuse to relax our grip on the behavioral patterns, the spiritual bonds imposed by our culture. We change the world then by changing ourselves. In the Middle East, sited at the crossroads of three civilizations, tyrannical hegemony was unstable. The common people survived in humble solidarity. Jesus of Nazareth found among the teachings of his culture two foundational principles. Call unconditional love into the world, love God, and use it to strengthen the virtues found in your community, love your neighbor. Through reciprocity, we temper the destructive urges of precursor spirituality. In securing the compact of reciprocity, we must surrender to the witness of unconditional love, trusting it to intercede in our relationships, shifting its weight from one to another so that all advance towards fulfillment. Growing up in the 60s, I was steeped in controversies concerning the meaning of love. I concluded that the complexity had nothing to do with love. It had to do with the conditions, the demands of loyalty imposed upon us by those that we love. Friendship is perhaps the purest relationship, but lovers, children, siblings, colleagues, and community impose expectations that can drain our vitality. When I finally refined the complexities down to the core, which is unconditional love, my attempts to share my conclusions were rebuffed with the complaint that I was thinking too much or making everything too complicated. In fact, nothing is simpler than love. What is complicated are the arguments that people raise against subscribing to its expression. Among those arguments, scientific materialism presents the most profound challenge. In these lectures, I have done my best to address that challenge. For those that love, I hope that I have helped to soften any expectations that prevent its great power from flowing through you into the world. Thank you for sharing the journey with me.